All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, November 5th of 2021. Thanks for tuning into the stream today. I am joined here by a very sleepy dog there in the background. Don't know if Mav's watching me here live, but there's your pup for the day here. But hope you guys all enjoyed the NHL stream from yesterday. Thank you again to Mr. Clean and Couch for coming on and teaching me the ways of NHL DFS. Threw a couple lineups in, threw just one lineup in yesterday into a single entry, but felt like I had a much stronger idea of what to do with that lineup than I did before. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys that watched it as well. If you haven't seen it yet, it is up on our YouTube channel here now, How to Beat NHL DFS in 2021. Highly recommend going and checking that out. I know there's been a ton of hockey questions. Again, I'm still just getting my feet under me in the NHL DFS world. So it was just really great to have a couple people that know what they're talking about here come on and talk a little bit about that. So got a few questions in the queue here today. A little bit about my research builds, research build process for NBA, what that looks like, or lack thereof there really. A couple questions about just research overall, content, researching through content and things like that. So we'll dive into all of that today, but not a lot of questions in the queue overall. So if you've got questions for me here, great day to fire them off into either YouTube chat or into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Those are the best two places to get your questions in. But let's go ahead. Let's start diving in here, and we'll talk about this here. And we'll get SaberSim up. Sweet. Good to go. So 9-game NBA slate tonight, which is great. And let's get this first question here. So this is a question that I got from Phantom via DM here, and wanted to talk about this a bit, about my research builds here. So he said, hi, Jordan. Not sure if you've covered this before, but do you do kind of a research build for NBA as well? Does it follow a similar concept as, I assume that's MLB and NFL? Really enjoyed the NFL one. Hoping to get caught up on the NHL vid from yesterday and the recent NBA contest selection video. Yeah. So cool. So my research builds, right? So what is this concept? I've talked about this a lot. I do this strategy quite a bit in both baseball and football. If you've seen my videos that I've put out on walking through my entire process here, you'll be kind of familiar with this. But the idea here is running builds on very high sim variance, 10 sim variance, 0, 0, 10 sliders, and building 1,500 or so lineups. So we'll do one of these real quick just to see what this would look like in NBA. And I'll talk about kind of what I think the value of this is. Also, what I think some of the drawbacks are. The spoiler alert here that is coming is that I actually don't do this as much for basketball for a few reasons. The primary reason, by far the biggest reason why I don't spend as much time doing these research builds in basketball is because the news that comes out in NBA breaks so late right up against lock that a lot of times there just simply isn't enough time for this, right? On an NFL Sunday, inactives come out 90 minutes before kickoff. The teams are pretty good with getting that information in prior to kickoff. Our final sims run an hour before game time. Then you got like this full hour, or even if you account for the time of the sims, maybe 45 minutes to get everything finalized and in. And for baseball, even if you don't have all the lineup cards out at lock, which a lot of times you don't, a lot of times you don't really need that news that could potentially break isn't going to like flip the slate on its head, except for maybe a couple slates out of the year. But in NBA, it will, right? Like last night, Korkmaz got ruled out 15 minutes before lock and pretty much changed everything. I mean, the Sixers' value became spectacularly better plays. Ownership all shifted around. Everything changes at the last second. So there's just not a lot of time to run this 1,500 lineup build, learn something from it, and then act on it in another totally separate build. But again, let's go ahead and talk about what we're actually doing here. So in a research build, right, when we run this build at 0, 0, 10 sliders, what we are getting is essentially a simulation, 1,500 different slate simulations. We're using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build every single individual lineup. So this is, in effect, a simulation of what could be the optimal if the slate played out 1,500 times. You can then kind of compare the projected ownership to the exposure of how often a certain player is showing up in the optimal lineup here, and determine what kind of the best fades and plays on the slate are. So I've mentioned in my NBA one, plays that I'm always interested in getting some exposure to are plays that are really, especially 10 leverage points over, right? If they're showing up in 10% more lineups, 10% more optimals than the field is going to play them, I really like those plays. A player will have my attention if they're showing up in 5% more, right? They're showing up in 5% more optimals than the field is going to roster those players, and vice versa with negative leverage too. Players that are maybe negative 10 leverage in particular, but negative 5 points of leverage plus are typically plays that I like to look at as fades. But again, I don't actually do this in NBA very often here because sure, we can run this here at it's 12:05 my time here, and maybe say, okay, maybe Steph Curry's a good fade tonight. But if news breaks, right, that changes the slate, even if it's not in the Warriors, right? But if something happens here prior to lock that the slate's going to change, suddenly the whole way lineups are going to be built, what optimals look like, all of that stuff is going to change right up before lock, and there's just not a lot of time to do this. You're also going to be late swapping a lot. And I think while it's very easy to do a lot of exposure, like really dive into your exposure management before a slate starts and get your leverage on the field in the way that you want, I think it's a little bit harder, one, to just even edit those exposures here when late swapping, which I realize is maybe a little bit of a limitation of editing exposures in the entry editor. But also, it's hard to know if your min and max exposures are still appropriate when big news breaks after lock and you have to late swap, right? Like, let's say we take a negative stance on Curry and we are half the field on him, right? But then, Wiggins gets ruled out or something like that. Then is it still the right move? Or even some other player on the slate, maybe Giannis gets ruled out and he's resting tonight, just as an example. Well, now one of those big pay-up options has been removed from the slate. Maybe that actually makes Curry a more viable option, right? Those questions are hard to know and answer quickly unless you're running research builds every time news breaks, which just isn't sustainable. So that's why I don't really do this as much in NBA. The final reason here, I guess, and I know maybe it's not super helpful for me to sit here and talk for a long time about all the reasons I don't want to do something. But the one other thing I do want to point out is that, and I mentioned this in my NFL stream that I put out, in my NFL video, building 150 high upside NFL DFS lineups with SaberSim. I put that out this week on Monday. But I noted this there as well, is on a sport where your sim variance slider by default is going to be lower, I would exercise additional, or even a contest type, right? I would exercise additional caution using a research build to heavily influence your process, right? Because the big assumption we're making here overall is that the percent of times the player shows up in the optimal lineup using single game sims with 1,500 slate simulations is a good enough approximation to how often they show up in the winning lineup for the contest you're playing, right? That is a big assumption we're making. And in NFL, when your sliders are going to look like for the mini-max, for example, your sliders are going to look something like this. It's a pretty good approximation because sim variance is already at 10, right? And the rate at which a player shows up in the mathematically optimal lineup is going to well approximate how often they show up in the winning lineup for that contest. But in basketball, where variance is lower and also the contests are a little bit smaller, right? The sim variance is going to be lower. So running builds where sim variance is at 10 to approximate how often a player shows up in the winning lineup is going to be less of a good approximation, right? I think what is ultimately going to happen is a research build is going to lead you to believe that chalk is less good than it actually is. It will probably lead you to making probably much more heavy stands on the chalk than you might actually want to, depending on the contest you're playing. And if you're playing single entries or 3 maxes or things like that, that effect is going to be even more significantly amplified from there. So I would exercise some caution, particularly in that regard there. So all of this to say, I guess, I think a research build probably can still be pretty interesting to run, especially maybe an hour before lock, just to get an idea of where some of those opportunities could be to get a leverage play. I think this would probably still be my preferred choice of how I would go about doing that. But just be prepared that it could be totally blown up by late breaking news that happens right before lock or after lock. And also that I wouldn't treat this as less gospel than you might on a baseball build or an NFL build, because it's a lower variance sport, where how often the player shows up in the mathematical optimal in different slate simulations is going to much more poorly approximate how often they show up in the winning lineup in your contests. So anyway, Phantom, don't know if you had a chance to watch this live here today. I know we chatted a little bit here earlier this morning about this, but hopefully that was a little bit helpful, a little bit more of a deep dive into what I'm kind of thinking there. But anyway, let's keep it rolling here. I'm going to hit this question. This one came in from Nancy Drew Guy. In step 1 of the projections, should we do the min and max exposures? If so, what is your tips for doing that? I'm going to be completely honest. I don't think since we have added this functionality, this ability to set min and max exposures before build, I don't think I have done it even once. I literally do not think I've done it one time. All it's going to do, what it is going to do is it's basically going to give you some control in the same way you might control your exposures in the post-build process. It's going to allow you to control that in the pre-build process. And it will allow you to get a pool that is a little bit more dialed into what you are looking for. I think for 90% of cases, especially if you're building 1,500 lineups for your pool, you're going to have plenty of lineups in your pool to edit whatever you want here in the post-build process. And I think it's better to edit it in the post-build process. So you could maybe say, I'm going to manage my risk a little bit on Cade Cunningham. Maybe I'm completely fading Curry because I want leverage there. And maybe I want to make sure that I have some more Harden. I'm going to play 25 Harden lineups, right? Like, you're probably going to be able to do most of what you would want to do with your exposures in step 3. And I think it's better to do it in step 3 because you at least get the opportunity of seeing what the builder is going to give to you by default. And you can see, maybe you went into this thinking I'm 100% going to play a ton of Harden tonight because they're playing the Pistons. And I don't know, maybe Pistons are bad, right? But then you see you only get one Harden lineup out of 150. That gives you a chance to check yourself and be like, okay, do I actually really want to do that? You don't get that luxury of getting a chance to check yourself when you set these exposures beforehand in step 1. So that was the one thing I would caution you. But the primary reason I think maybe it would be useful to use these at all is if you had, first of all, if you had done some work on your own and you've determined what you think is an appropriate exposure range for a bunch of different players, and you want to just make sure that the pool of lineup looks like that, I think it makes sense to set this ahead of time. You can actually even upload that information here. So like you can actually now upload your min and max exposures the same way you might upload custom projections or ownership. I think that could be a useful reason to do it. I would also say, if you were really tight on time, for example, maybe news breaks and you're like in a time crunch or something like that, and you want to just make sure like a certain value play gets into your lineups, I think you could justify maybe saying, I don't know, like I know I want 30% Dame and I've got time to run one more build before lock, so I'm just going to pop that in there. But I really wouldn't sweat this that much. I think the most useful situation for somebody to use this before build is if they had a range of a min and max exposure that they wanted for almost every player on the slate, and we're going to upload that ahead of time. Otherwise, I think you're going to have plenty of flexibility to just make your minor exposure tweaks here or there in the quality control phase in step 3. So. But cool. Bryson said, for something like NBA or NFL cash lineup, should the percentile be set lower than average for a safer lineup or a more consistent one at least? It's an interesting question. I've heard this idea before. I think in particular, let's go ahead. Let's build some cash lineups. So the one thing that I do think is wrong, right, is you hear sometimes people say use the 25th percentile and optimize your cash lineups based on floor. And the reason why I think that is just straight up wrong is because a lineup optimized for the floor, right, the best possible scoring lineup you can make when every player on the lineup hits their floor isn't going to cash anyway, right? Like we aren't shooting for a 25th percentile outcome. So like optimizing for the best case scenario when that outcome happens, I think is just straight up a mistake. It's not in NBA in particular. It's not going to have a dramatic impact on your cash lineups because players are normally distributed, and right, like this actually isn't going to change much. But I do think it is theoretically incorrect to build your lineup this way. And in a sport like NFL, where players are a little less normally distributed, I think you'll see a little bit more why this is wrong. I think there is an argument to be made that the optimal strategy is optimizing for 50th percentile, which is different than the average percentile. The average percentile is literally that player's average score. If you sum up all the total projected points they score in all the game simulations we have, and then divide by the number of game simulations. It's their geometric mean, their mathematical average, right? The 50th percentile is the middle outcome. So if you removed game simulations from their ceiling and then one from their absolute floor and kept removing game simulations, that middle game sim is their median. That's their 50th percentile. And I think there is definitely an argument to be made that this is truly the optimal way to build a cash lineup. But in reality, this actually I don't think is going to change very much at all. I don't know if it adds value long term. I think it probably just is a different way of doing it. I don't think you are actually getting a higher expected value cash lineup by picking a lineup that's optimized for the 50th percentile than for the average percentile. For NFL, again, I think I could be sold on the idea that there is maybe a little bit of a edge found there, just a tiny one, not a huge difference. But again, let's look at this here. Players in NFL, especially the skill position players, rather than having a perfect bell curve, a perfect normal distribution, have this like skewed curve where most of their outcomes are under their mean. They look a little bit more, they're a little bit closer to the floor, and then they have a long tail of ceiling games. So optimizing for the mean projection is going to overweight a player with a long ceiling tail in their range of outcomes. Here, I'll just show you what I'm talking about. So like a player like Kadarius Toney, right? It's not a perfect bell curve. Instead, you have these game outcomes that are going to be below his mean. His mean is 16.61, right? You see like the peak of the curve is below 16. And then he has this long tail of ceiling outcomes, which drives up that mean. If we switch this here, let's go ahead. First, let me just bump these down a bit. But if we switch this to median 50th percentile, you will get players that have a higher. So we still actually get a lot of Toney, but you can see his number comes down, right? And you're going to get players that have a little bit of a safer projected outcome. So yeah, I think probably this is the theoretically optimal way to build a cash game, but I think you're talking about a very, very small edge in terms of what this actually adds. So we've gone back and forth with this a little bit too, like here internally at SaberSim of whether this should actually be the default for cash games. And I just don't know. I don't know if it actually adds much value, if at all, but I don't know. For anybody that maybe grinds a lot of cash, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts too on that. That's my take. I think you might squeeze out maybe a percentage point of additional edge there, if that. But and then Bryson followed this up by saying, if I have an exam at 5:30 Central Time today, so that is what is that? That's 30 minutes before lock, but still want to play main slate. Do you have any suggestions for making lineups that would be somewhat resistant to late actives and inactive decisions? Honestly, I know this isn't the answer you want to hear. I would skip the slate. I really would. I think you're really just taking on too much risk. If news breaks after the slate that changes the projections even by 5 points, like if it makes the cash optimal, even if you're playing GPPs, right? But if it makes the cash optimal a few points higher, right? Like that's enough of a projection change that all of those lineups you built at lock are probably minus EV now. I really believe that for NBA in particular. You can just get crushed by that. I would say if you really want to play, I get it. I would either maybe jam some showdowns in, right? I think again, SaberSim is pretty well equipped to deal with NBA showdowns. I've seen people having a lot of success with that so far this season. So I'd play some of the showdowns, or maybe consider just like if you want to sweat, to just fire on something like the 530 turbo. I guess that would be or 730. That would be the 630 turbo for you. So still an hour, right? You'd still be in your exam an hour before lock, which I'm still not super comfortable with, but I think it's a little bit safer. I think if you're asking me for like what is the optimal bankroll growth profitability answer to this question, it is skip the slate 100%. If you really want to sweat, if you really want to sweat the main slate and just play it, I would say scale back your bankroll significantly and maybe just fire a single lineup in there and maybe play players that are playing in the early games, right? Or play the turbo slate or the showdowns. But the right answer is to skip it. So, Aaron said, how do you feel about the rule no more than X amount of players per team? I know Max, especially on bigger slates, sets a rule like that, where you can go in here and set stacking and say like no more than 3 players on the same team. I think that's probably a common one. I think giving yourself a little bit more wiggle room would be 4, but I think Max a lot of times sets this at 3 players. I don't mind doing that. I think you're not going to get a lot of lineups that are built that way anyway, right? By default on a big slate, I don't think you're going to see a lot of you're not going to see a lot of like four-man stacks here. I think the concern I would have with setting that stacking rule is you got to make sure that you know the right time to pull it off, because there is sometimes a right time to pull it off. Like, let's just say I know I use the same player every single day for my example, but at some point this season, Giannis is going to get ruled out for rest, and it's probably going to happen after lock, right? If Giannis gets ruled out tonight after lock, lineups that have 4 or even 5 Bucks players could potentially be optimal. And if you have a stacking rule set, so you can see here, right? 20 lineups, default settings. We didn't get any 4-man stacks anyway. But if you have a rule that's set to prevent that, you could potentially sacrifice some edge there. So I don't think there's anything wrong with setting a rule just to make sure you don't have that. I would say you should keep an eye on things and know when the right time to take it off is. I think the safer choice is what I would recommend is leave the stacking rule off, but go check your stack types after. Because if you run that build one day and you see that you're getting 40% 4-man stacks, it's going to be an indication to you that it's one of those slates where, because some star got ruled out and now it's viable to play 4-man stacks on that team. So same thing with slate size too, right? On a 9-game slate, it's always going to be harder to build these kinds of lineups and be profitable, but where's that line drawn, right? Is it at 3 games, 4 games, 5 games, 6 games? Like at some point, it doesn't make sense to do that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it from a theory standpoint. I think it makes sense. The builder is going to agree with you on 90% of slates, but sometimes on the right slate, when a stud gets ruled out, those kinds of lineups make a lot of sense to play. So I see some other questions rolling in here. I'm going to jump back here real quick and hit some of the questions that came into Slack. I know. Okay, so I'll start here. Casey, I think this is a good question to like kind of just lead us into this, but there's been a ton of conversation about this the past 24 hours or so. But he said, can you either place some links to good research sites or discuss them in office hours, please? There are a ton of fantasy research sites out there, but filtering all of them and having to pay for each one is a nightmare. Honestly, I really don't do a ton of research outside of SaberSim for building my lineups. I really don't. Like, even my research process of doing my research builds all takes place within the app. I'll listen to podcasts or watch YouTube videos here or there. I'm not really that even selective of what I watch. And most of the time I watch those, I'm more interested in learning what the chalk is. I want to know. I don't want to know. I'm not out there watching other videos to figure out who I'm going to play. I want to see what the field thinks are the best plays. So someone mentioned Al Smizzle. I think he makes good videos. They're entertaining. There's plenty of other videos out there. I've watched Pat Mayo a bit here and there. I don't know. Honestly, here's what I would say. ultimately, if you're interested in going down that path, is I would find somebody that you think is just interesting to listen to or entertaining to listen to, and treat any research you're seeing with a grain of salt. We do have a video out there here, and I'll mention this video real quick. And Max and I recorded this video to kind of answer this particular question. So it's on our YouTube page under strategy sessions. And the video is called The 3 Steps to Better NFL DFS Research. And the kind of core idea of this is to go out there and watch your videos or listen to podcasts or whatever you want to do, but take some notes, right? Write down what you are hearing throughout the week, and then combine it with using SaberSim as a bit of an advisor, and kind of ultimately make your own decision and make your adjustments to exposures or projections, but make your adjustments to those things, right? Kostas just said, more you watch, the more confused you become. Yeah, I think you can get a little bit paralyzed by like over researching. Again, that's why I like to compartmentalize things and say, you know, I like to watch my videos. I like to see how people are thinking about the slate. I find that stuff entertaining. I'm walking the dog. I like to listen to an NFL podcast, but a lot of times, again, I'm still more thinking about it from the standpoint of like, what does the field think the best plays are? Or even when people are like, here are my sleepers, right? Well, then what do the field think the sleepers are, right? Rather than thinking, these are the guys I'm going to go now play. I'm going to force exposure to these guys. That's the way I like to approach it. So I know, I mean, that's literally kind of just ultimately what I'm doing with this. I think I totally welcome if there is a video out there. I mentioned this to Lundar, who was also asking some questions about this the other day. If there's a video or a podcast or a tweet or something like that that you find interesting, that you think is helpful, I definitely feel like throw that into the sport-specific channel that it applies to, or throw it into the random channel. Maybe if it's a little bit less like directly relevant to the sport. I'm totally fine sharing that kind of stuff, and I think that's great. Spread that information out. But again, what I'm mostly doing, I would say my content consumption in the DFS space is primarily for streams that I think are just entertaining, that I'm not even doing so much research, that I just think are literally entertaining, or to figure out what the field is going to do. And my actual individual research process of how I'm going to attack the slate and what players I want to play is mostly done on SaberSim. That's just my overall process. So if you are interested in literally seeing what that looks like in practice, again, I'd check out this video for NFL, building high upside NFL DFS lineups with SaberSim. Just put that out on Monday. Shows my process, and it all takes place on SaberSim. And that is legitimately what my Sunday mornings look like. So I would say Max and Danny and Matt, I think too, do have some videos on our YouTube here. Some older ones here. So they are, you know, from last year, 1 year ago, but 2 years ago in certain cases, talking about how they would go through and make adjustments to like things like the projections and what research tools they would do to do that. And I know there was a question. Oh, let me pull up the original question here. I know there was a question about this the other day, maybe yesterday, about somebody that watched one of these videos for NBA and then had some questions about that. I will say, I think our SaberSim's models have come a lot further in 2 years than where they were at the time, right? We've improved significantly. I think the need to make adjustments to player projections has gone down significantly. But if you are interested in an approach that maybe is a little bit more involved with the research process, I would check out some of these videos here. They're sport specific. So like football, right? Adjusting projections. I'd go check out this. There's a couple for basketball too, if you're interested in adding value in that way. But so anyway. All right, cool. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to hit this question here. This is another one from KC here, and this came in Slack. I see there's some questions in YouTube chat as well. We'll go ahead and get to those before the end of the stream. But KC said, not having a great deal of luck on my 20-entry single game or my NFL main pool GPPs on DraftKings or 150 FanDuel. I've been watching your videos, but really more interested in how to properly fade players. Yeah, so my approach for the NFL side of things, again, for determining what players that I think are going to be inefficiently owned, is to do these research builds, right? This is kind of my approach, right? This isn't the only way to do this, but this is the way that makes a lot of sense to me. And again, what I like to do is we'll do one for NFL. Let's see how things are looking, because I haven't even researched the slate for NFL this week so far. So again, all I'm going to do is I'm going to turn sliders to 0, 0, 10, right? I think this is a good starting point of figuring out where maybe some fades are. And what we're going to do here, again, single game simulation is going to determine each lineup here. It's the optimal lineup for one single random game simulation of every game on the slate. We're going to do it 1,500 times. We're going to see how often certain players show up in the optimal lineup. And then we're going to compare that number to their projected ownership. And again, it's Friday, right? Still a lot of time before the weekend. I just realized it's Friday. I feel like I was about to say it's Wednesday or something. But there's still a lot of time before Sunday, so this will change. But this is a good opportunity to get familiar with the slate overall, see how things are looking. And a good way to determine your fades is to look for players that are going to be rostered at a greater percentage of lineups than their chance to actually be optimal. This is my number one favorite way to figure out where the fades are. Now, I will couple this with the research I've done throughout the week of learning where the chalk is going to be. And that's probably why my favorite kind of content to read and watch and stuff like that out there, my favorite kind of content, or let me put it this way, my favorite thing to get out of the content I consume is figuring out where the chalk's going to be, because ultimately that projected ownership number is so important to my process, right? I think that's why I like to think about it that way. But this is how I determine kind of where my fades are going to be, or at least where I'm thinking maybe the inefficient ownership is. And I did it last week, and in this video, again, you could watch me do it here. In this particular video, first of all, I recorded this video before the Calvin Ridley news and the Jamal Williams news came out last weekend. So and what I ended up doing actually ended up being a little bit different. But in this video, I thought Darrell Henderson and Chris Godwin were the fades. Those were the good plays to be off of. They both had good games, but that's fine. That happens sometimes. But those were kind of my stands that I was going to take in that video. Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll look at the full pool of 1,500 lineups, and it's going to say we need to make an adjustment to this. And I like to use this leverage column here to figure out what are the biggest differences between the good plays and what are going to be the most over-owned plays relative to their ownership, right? I mean, first of all, if there's legitimately going to be a defense that's 20% owned, right? If the field is going to say we're gonna play a ton of Chiefs defense because Jordan Love is starting, like that's an insta fade, right? Even if they're the most optimal defense, which they might be, yeah, they are, right? This is way too much ownership, and you can just see that here now, right? They're showing up as optimal in 11% of game sims or 11% of slate sims, but if the field has 20% ownership, that's easy. That's an insta fade. But then you can kind of look at some other players that are popping up here. I don't know is Noah Fant out? If Fant's out and the field is thinking that, I used to know how to pronounce this guy's name. I don't remember. Anyway, this guy, right? That maybe is a fade, right? Looking at a couple of these high price running backs are showing up here too. Eckler and Cook, right? I'm curious. Let's look. I'm going to search running back here. So here's another way of seeing like another fade, potential fade opportunity, or at least under the field opportunity, right? You can kind of see sorting by ownership. If the field is going to play this slate, thinking that Austin Eckler and Dalvin Cook are by far the best two running back options, you can see that our exposure here, like the chance of being optimal, is actually much more flat than that. And maybe the good opportunity here is to be underweight on Eckler and Cook and be overweight on some of these other guys in a similar projection salary range, right? So this is kind of how I start to think about this coming together. And I think this can be a really powerful tool to figure out where your best fades are. I did say in that video, I'm going to mention this here now. I did say in that video that one number I kind of key into here is -10 leverage or 10 positive leverage on a player. And I think I maybe overemphasized that in the video because I've had now a ton of people. Oh God, that's annoying. I've had a ton of people now come back and say like, what about 8 percentage points of leverage? Or what if they're not, what if they're not 10, but they're 8.3, or we just did an NBA research build and Steph Curry was like -9.7. And I know like I would probably get a question there that's like, well, what if he's just under -10? I wouldn't key. I think I overemphasized that number of -10 too much in the video. I would look more just at who the highest positive leverage plays are and who the highest negative leverage plays are. And your negative leverage plays are good opportunities for fades, players you want to be under the field on or fade completely. And players that are positive leverage, I think, are plays that you want to be over the field on. So coupled with a sense of ownership, right? Like this, I know for a fact this isn't right. I am certain of it. I am positive that Lamar Jackson is not going to be 6% owned. Maybe I'm going to end up being wrong there, but I would bet this is closer to 10, which means that this leverage play is it's still good, but it's less good, right? So doing a little bit of your own ownership research and figuring out who's going to be owned on the slate, I think can be helpful too. But this is going to be a weird slate this week. Like a lot of quarterbacks got hurt. Is Sam Darnold out? PJ Walker showing up as projected right now. That feels like maybe that's just wrong. But the New Orleans situation is interesting. The Packers situation is interesting. It's going to be a weird week. So anyway, that's how I like to look at that. And you can take the same approach for showdowns. You can do the exact same thing for showdowns. Exact same process. So run a build, 0-0-10 sliders, look at your full pool of 1,500 and compare exposure to ownership and see where the leverage is. So let's jump back a little bit. Make sure I got all these questions here. Let me go back to the start of the stream because sometimes I miss these questions that came in early. So Will had a question here. If you have a 3-max contest type, is it possible to like a lineup if you simulate 100 lineups? I see the opt out, but not hand picking. Does that make sense? Yeah, it does. So here's what I would do. So let's go back to NBA. And I think this is a really good approach if you're only playing a few lineups, as opposed to just saying, build me 3 and just play the instant 3 you see, which again is also probably fine. But if you want to have a little bit more control over what 3 you get. So you use your sliders, right? Probably something a little bit closer to this. You build your lineups. 500 is fine. Actually, we don't even need 500 in this case. Let's say we just need pool 200 so we can build faster. I'll show you how I do this. I've done this before. Okay, so you make your 2 projection edits so you can see your lineup. So here's how I typically like to do this, is you can press this little button here and it will just collapse that exposure thing. Makes it easier to see. You can always bring it back by pressing it again and it'll just come back, but I like to collapse it. And then if you click this pool tab here, you can see every lineup in your pool of 200. So then what I actually typically end up doing is I will uncheck all of these lineups and say no here, right? So now we have no lineups in the pool. And I will actually go through then and, oh, that was kind of annoying. Why did it do that? Okay, hang on. That's probably, that trashed those lineups. That's not what I wanted to happen. I guess we'll just do it this way. Here's what I'll do. We'll leave those 3 lineups in there, but what I'll do is I'll go ahead and look through and I'll check in every lineup that I think looks kind of good. And whatever your particular process is for determining if a lineup looks good. Maybe you're looking at raw projected score. Maybe you're looking at Saber score or ownership or some combination of that. Or you know that there's a certain, if you know there's a certain player you're looking for, you can even filter that way. Like maybe you say, I'm like, my lineup is going to play Giannis. You can filter by Giannis and then only see Giannis lineups, right? Like whatever you want to do. But what you can do from there is just check the lineups in. So I'll go through and maybe say, I was doing this a lot for Baseball Showdown when I was playing a little bit of Baseball Showdown earlier in the playoffs and World Series. So maybe I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of like that lineup too. This lineup looks kind of good. And maybe I end up with like a pool of like 10. So I'm like, okay, I kind of like these 10 lineups and I'm going to try to pick 3 from there. Then you can go back to my lineups here and then kind of slowly eliminate them. So we have these are the 10 lineups I liked, right? I checked them all in. We see 10 up here now. And now I'm going to narrow down. And I don't actually want that one. And I don't want this one. And maybe you're narrowing in and you're figuring out, you can see the lineups here is going down as I'm doing this. And I think this can be kind of a clever way. So maybe, you know what, these are the 3. This can be kind of a clever way to actually arrive at your final pool of lineups that you end up playing. So And it just so happens that the 3 lineups we end up playing are rank 2, rank 13, and rank 17 of our original pool of 200. So all pretty good lineups still. But good question, though. Jack said, hi, how do you find the expected value of your lineups? That is the hard question. That is very hard. Calculating expected value in DFS is really difficult because the way you would calculate it is you would come up with the probability of that lineup coming in every single possible place in the contest you're playing, and then multiply that probability by the payout when that outcome takes place, and summing up that entire set of numbers. That would be your expected value of a lineup. But it is a very hard problem to solve because there are other people playing, right? There's other lineups. You don't necessarily know what all the other lineups in the contest are going to be. If you did, for example, it would be way easier to solve that calculation, and it would make DFS way more profitable, right? That is part of the reason why when there were few years ago in DFS, there were a lot of concerns about the integrity of the game, of like that information getting out. That is why that information is so valuable, right? Because once you know what the lineups are going to be in the contest, it's easier to build high expected value lineups. Calculating expected value is very, very difficult in DFS. I would say you can approximate it easily. You can make estimations of what the highest expected value lineups are going to be. In fact, the SaberScore calculation we have, which takes into account the correlation, the ownership, and the raw scoring upside of a lineup, that is in effect an approximation of calculating EV. That is what we are trying to do with this. You can also calculate expected value with like a full, very rigorous slate simulation, like something that you've built yourself basically to fully simulate out contests and like simulate what the lineups that people are going to play are, right? That would be another way to do it. But it's very hard. There is not an EV column on SaberSim. And the reason why is because that calculation is very, very hard to come up with. And I would say like that is basically the game of DFS, is actually figuring out what the highest expected value lineup is. That is essentially the game for the contest you're playing and the payout structure and everything like that. That's basically it. That's why there's a game to play to begin with, because that number is hard to solve for. So you can solve for that number very easily when you're doing something like sports betting, right? You have a written odds. You have odds that are being given to you that imply the probability of a certain event happening. If you can calculate the true implied probability of that event happening, you can very quickly calculate the expected value of a bet. But with DFS, it is way harder. So, but the more practical answer, I realize that was a little bit theoretical. The more practical answer is on SaberSim. This SaberScore number is our attempt to quantify what the highest expected value lineups are in your pool for the contest that you tell us you're playing. So it will change based on what you use for these sliders here, or for what you use for these drop downs, and then therefore where the sliders go to. This is our attempt to quantify that number. And as far as I know, I don't think there's any other optimizer out there that's even attempting to do this. So very valuable there. But Hustle said, shout out to SaberSim, took down a GPP last night on DK. Congratulations, man. That's awesome. I know it has been a pretty good October and early November here for our subscribers. We've been seeing a lot of people tweet at us and send in their screenshots to the winner circle. So that is awesome here. Mike said, playing single entry or 3-max, what are realistic expectations in terms of at least cashing? Throw away cashing expectations. Doesn't matter. Really doesn't. The goal is not to cash. The goal is to win. The goal is to come on top 1%. From there, whether you bink it or not is a lot of variance, but top 1% is what we're shooting for. So I would say completely get rid of your expectations of how often a lineup is cashing. If you want to track how well you are doing in DFS in a way that is better than looking at just profit or ROI, which are also kind of fickle numbers, track how often your lineups are coming in the top 1%. If you are outpacing 1% of the time, you're doing well, right? I think a very, very good DFS player is probably going to put 1.5 to 2% of their lineups in the top 1% of a contest. A good player overall is going to have 1.1 to 1.5% of their lineups in the top 1%. Depends a little bit on sport too. In different sports, you can get a little bit more of an edge or have a little bit less of an edge. But Don't look at caching percent. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. The lineups aren't even built that way. If you're using SaberSim to build your lineups, we're not optimizing for min cash equity. The highest min cash equity lineups you can build for almost any contest you're playing are going to be probably this: cash settings, highest average projection possible. These lineups, even for a single entry, right? This is true even for single entry. These are built to win. So they are going to underperform their min cash equity, actually, probably, right? They're going to underperform their caching expectation. So actually, that may or may not be true, because caching in a GPP still means you're coming up with like a top 20 or top 25% lineup, which is probably something that you'll actually win. Because we're building for upside, you'll actually probably win that more often than you should, right? You'll probably have 25% of your lineups or so in the top 20% and cash. But with all that said, I still wouldn't focus on that very much. So I think it's a false. I think those are false goalposts. I don't think that's a good thing to shoot for. So, but that top 1% can be very powerful, and you can track that manually. I think that's pretty easy to just see. Compare, especially if you're just playing single or 3 max, right? Put how many lineups you put into the contest, see how they do at the end of the night, track how many are in the top 1%. And again, if you're just playing 1 lineup or 3 lineups or something like that, it's going to take a long time even before you have an expectation of putting 1 lineup, right? If you're playing let me put it this way. This is actually going to be kind of crazy. This is a good way of thinking about this. If you're playing 1 lineup a slate, right? 1 lineup, single entry. And your expectation is that you are going to put a lineup in the top 1%, 2% of the time, right? You are twice as good as you would expect to. You are probably going to have to play on average 50 slates before you even expect that outcome to take place. And that would be for a really good player, right? This is now kind of coming into why I think playing only single entry or 3 max is dangerous, because it takes so long to realize that edge. But it would take you 50 slates putting 2 lineups in the top 1% every 100 slates you play, right? That's 2 divided by 100, 1 out of 50, before that is even on average supposed to occur. So you would want to track this over a long period of time. The other thing that's nice, like thinking about this, the other thing that's nice about playing multi-entry is you get to realize if you're good or bad, if you are playing well, or if you need to make a change much faster, because you get way more lineups in, you get way more data points in your sample much faster. So, right? Like, anyway, I feel like I'm definitely rambling a little bit. Got excited about this particular question, but takeaways here: don't look at cash percent, because it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Look at top 1% equity and play more lineups. It's better for your bankroll. You will realize your edge faster, but it is also better for your process. You will realize if your process sucks or if it's good much faster. So, good question though. All right, let's see. Have another question here in Slack. Let's see. Just want to make sure. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions here. But this is from Watuz. I think it's probably Watuz. He said, does the NBA projected ownership numbers take into account what the rest of the industry is taking into consideration? Meaning, should I make adjustments in step 1 if you show 40% projected own, but a couple other sites show 60%? Or is that already factored into the 40%? I don't want to double down on adjustments if so, or waste time if this doesn't matter. Thank you. Okay, that's a good question. So we take into account what the rest of the field is thinking about the slate in terms of the way that we generate our ownership projections. So what we use is we'll use like an aggregate projection, not just SaberSim's projections, but like a field aggregate. And then we build thousands of lineups at a high variance setting, and the exposures of those players end up becoming the ownership projections. So in that way, we do take that into account. But we don't go and look at anybody else's ownership projections and then make manual adjustments or anything like that. So yes, these are legitimately our projections of what the real ownership is going to be in the contest based on what we perceive the field thinks about the slate. But we're not like, if a competitor has Cade Cunningham at 50, we're not going to be like, oh, we're too low on him, bump him up to 45, right? It just is what we project him. So I think the ownership projections this season are the best they have ever been by far. I think the updates we made this offseason made them much, much better. But I do still think it can be a good place to add value, whether you want to look at legitimately a competitor's ownership projections, or if you want to just do your own research about what the slate looks like. And I think sometimes one of the most valuable things you can do is apply your own intuition, right? As a human and DFS player, you may have a better sense of what people are intuitively going to do with their DFS lineups than a model will, right? So I think you can find some ways to add value there. I particularly notice that. I think that's most powerful for NBA in seeing the guys, rather than being like, these are the guys everybody's going to play. I can sometimes kind of get a sense like, no, people aren't going to play that guy that much. Like, that's a good play. I get why he projects well, and I think maybe that's actually just a good play to have in your lineups, but the field isn't going to see, like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope might be a good example of that, right? Like, again, I haven't done a ton of research in this particular slate. I don't know if maybe somebody's out for Washington, but this to me is clearly like a little bit of a pricing inefficiency, right? He's like almost min price and he projects for 5.85 points per dollar, but he's not a super high usage guy. I don't think he's going to be the 7th chalkiest player on the slate, right? I think in this particular case, the model is more kind of thinking like this is optimal, like this is what the field should do, but I don't think they're going to do this. And I think that could be a play that maybe is a little bit lower owned. And that's for NBA in particular, what I find are the best ways to add value to the ownership projections is to look at who the highest projected owned players are and see. You can compare to competitors if you want to, or you can just apply some of your own intuition or whatever you want to do and see who's not going to be as owned as we think. And that's also the highest impact, right? Like you could come down here and fiddle around with the ownership projections of guys projected under 10%, but it's not going to ultimately have a big impact on the lineups themselves. The players that are projected with a very higher ownership projection will have a higher impact on your lineups you get by making adjustments here. So. Okay, let me see. Let me look at this question here. This is from Freeman. And he said, how does the ownership tab affect the lineup selection score after you run a crunch? Is the lineup between if ownership is higher or lower? Okay, I assume, Freeman, are you talking about this? Here, well, let's let this build load. But this sort here over here, this ownership sort. Let's look at like 20, right? I assume that you're referring to this ownership tab up here, right? So this is purely a sort method. So basically right now, by default, well, let's go back to a bigger build here. Okay, this is a good one. So by default, we're going to sort by Saber score, which again is kind of our attempt to quantify, to rank lineups by expected value. So highest expected value lineup first. This ownership over here is a different sorting method that will sort highest to lowest ownership. So it is sorting your entire pool of 500 lineups. And these right here are the highest ownership sum lineups, the highest 20 ownership sum lineups out of our pool of 500. And if you click this little toggle button, it'll flip it. And these are our lowest 20 ownership sum lineups out of our pool of 500. So you can see our range of ownership values that the builder thinks is optimal for the first 500 lineups is between an ownership sum of 60 to 148. So that's all that's doing. It doesn't affect it doesn't rebuild any lineups. It doesn't affect the lineups. All it is resorting the pool of 500 to give the top 20 based on the current sort. So again, top 20 ownership, highest ownership sum lineups, lowest 20 ownership sum lineups. You can do this with all these different sorts. Saber score is, again, basically our attempt to quantify expected value. So this is the lowest expected value lineup in the pool. This is the highest expected value lineup in the pool based on our approximation of Saber score, right? I probably shouldn't say, I probably shouldn't say expected value because Saber score approximates expected value. It is not exact, but that's what we're trying to approximate. You can do it with projection too. So highest overall projected lineup in the pool, 281. Lowest overall projected lineup in the pool is 232. So that's what that does. Oh, it's Juarez. Juarez. That's funny. Sorry. What does? No, it's Juarez. Okay, cool. Now I get it. Mike said, thanks for the great answer. You guys do a great job here. Yeah, thank you. This is a good question. And definitely one that comes up often here. Min caching is fun, right? I don't even know if it's fun, right? It feels a little bit better than just breaking a slate, but it is an important brain switch to make of like, it really doesn't matter actually, right? You're not playing for the slates you min cache. You're playing for really like once or twice a season to take something down. So let's go ahead. I saw somebody sent me a message here. Will said, is there a way to see price history and game logs within SaberSim? There isn't, unfortunately. I like to use, I use price history. Price history isn't something I've actually dug into too much. I don't even know where I would necessarily send you for that. I just use Basketball Reference for the game logs. I think they're pretty clean presentation to see that information. But no, we don't have that on our site, unfortunately. I don't see any other questions. I think that might be about it. We'll go ahead and we will, let me make sure. I feel like I missed one. I definitely feel like there was one today that I missed. Let me go ahead, but maybe I got them all. I always feel bad. Every once in a while I miss a question, and then as soon as I hop off live here, I remember it, and I'm like, oh dang it, totally forgot about that one. But I don't see any other questions here showing up, so we'll go ahead and leave it right there. It's been another awesome week of office hours. Thank you to everybody that's watched, tuned in, asked questions, contributed to the chat, all kinds of stuff all week. Again, if you guys haven't seen it already, go check out the NHL strategy session that is now up on our YouTube channel. Really awesome stuff. Thank you again to Mr. Clean Couch coming on and teaching me your ways. But if you're interested in trying out NHL, high variance, high correlation sport, which means SaberSim is poised to excel at it. So definitely recommend watching that, checking it out, playing a little NHL. Enjoy the 9-game NBA slate tonight. Enjoy the, now I don't know, 5-game NHL slate. Now I have to check. That's embarrassing. I'm supposed to be the NHL guy now. What is it? 5-game NHL slate. NHL lock is an hour after NBA, makes it a lot more playable, a lot more easy to get your lineups in. So enjoy the slates tonight. Football coming up again here on Sunday. Enjoy the main slate. We will be around in the office hours channel, the support channels, the NFL channels, me, Max, some of the other guys on the SaberSim team answering questions as we approach another week of NFL here. And office hours will be right back here again at 2 p.m. Eastern on Monday. So if you have questions throughout the weekend, pop it in there. Last note here before we hop off, Lazaro says, are we doing Cade Cunningham again tonight? Don't have the stomach for it, lol. He popped off last night. He still can't make shots. I don't know. Pretty good play. Couldn't buy a bucket last night. And at least when I was watching the game, and still had a great night. I don't know if he turned it on, but he's racks up a lot of those, the other stats. So I don't know. He's probably going to, he's probably going to be popping there. But anyway, ultimately your guys' call. So anyway, have a good weekend, everybody. I will see you next week, and good luck until